Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Platformers live stream. And this week we had special guest, and we are going to discuss about platform as a migration accelerator. Please let me introduce you, Anthony, Zahi, and Jim. How are you today?
Good morning. Good afternoon. We're doing great.
That's great that you joined us. Thank you very much. Maybe we can go with when we can start with a quick round of introductions.
Sure. So hi, I'm Zahi. I work in the same team with Jim and Anthony. We are a prototyping team, and for the past, 2 years, we've been working a lot on platform engineering, but also helping customers doing migrations. So we figured, why don't we come here and talk about this today? Anthony?
Go ahead, Anthony.
I think Zahi said it all. Hi, everybody. I'm Anthony. Let's get started.
Yeah, kind of ditto there. Prototyping solutions architect, working with these great guys. Let's jump into it.
Thank you very much. So just before we start, I want to mention for the people in the audience that if you have any comments or question that you want to ask everyone in the session, feel free to comment. You can comment on the video on LinkedIn, on the video on YouTube. We will be able to see it in here and we will answer your questions. So maybe we can start a little bit. If you can explain a little bit, like what is your role? You mentioned like prototype engineering, just for people to understand what do you do?
Yeah. So we help. We are focused on global financial customers, usually large banks, and we're helping them with various domains in cloud. But the one we have been focused in the last 2 years is how they integrate the cloud into their platforms, how they can design platforms. And the consequence and result of this is usually, well, okay, now we built this, then, okay, how do we move things to this thing that we built? So that's a migration piece of it.
Amazing. And for people that don't know, these people actually maintain Harmonix, or previously called OPA, a platform solution that you can use. We have like a website for it and a video. We are not going to go deeper into Harmonix, but if you do want, you can go into the website. I will post it on the comments and go to explore after the session. So maybe we can start to talk a little bit about migration.
Yeah. Maybe you can share the screen.
Yeah.
Well, I guess maybe just to set up kind of the topics we wanted to discuss with you all. We gathered this from experience that we have been doing migration for a customer. The context of that customer specifically was migration to ECS, moving like about 100 apps to ECS, but that was also done was part of the notion of golden path and more things we're going to talk about today. But if you are trying to use migration and thinking about, how can I use my developer platform into this, I think this session will exactly the point we want to talk about. So maybe first talk about migration from and to. It's maybe the more obvious part. When we started working with that customer, we first have to understand the from. And Jim, correct me if I'm wrong. They have their own terminology and format of their. Yeah. You want to share?
Yes. So one of the customers that we worked with on migrating, they had several custom artifacts that helped to describe their applications. It was a proprietary format. So it introduced a few interesting challenges, but one of the key things to highlight is they're moving their applications from one hosted platform on-prem and trying to move and migrate those applications in bulk, in mass, to AWS. And I think the key takeaway that we had regardless of whether this format that they were using was proprietary, it was very important that they did have some sort of a descriptor that focused on describing very well the characteristics of the application. That can include some things like, how much memory might this take? Is this a CPU bound application and therefore might need more CPU? So capturing those kinds of characteristics in a standard format was something that we learned was very key to being able to enable bulk mass migrations.
Yeah, they also, like, what we had when we started looking at this is that everything was coupled together. So it's not just your application source code, but the runtime, the version of what they need to run that application, as well as dependent resources, relationship to cluster. All these things were bundled together, and we kind of have to decouple them. But if you think about it, it's not just decoupling them, because you could have a scenario when out of those whatever 100 number of apps, some of them may be using the same cluster. So how do we migrate all the things, but also consider maybe some of the things already there? So we not necessarily want to create everything, but maybe part of the artifact. And that's the end of the day, that kind of leads us to the design of the template and the golden path we have built, in order to not only migrate those things, but also to make it in a way that is kind of a Lego bricks, and you can, reuse some of the Lego bricks or create new pieces if you wish. Depends on the use case and the scenario. So this is, I guess, some of the things to consider, and it's obviously a lot. Migration is hard because not only you have to figure out infrastructure, which is maybe the most obvious thing, but you also have to figure out security, and you have to figure out, how do I move my data? Things like composition, what's the right order of doing things to ensure a proper migration? Error handling, validation, DR. There's so much into this to get it, but I think if we try to say, okay, what's the good news? The good news is that it actually makes you think about, when you build your pattern or your golden path in your developer platform. Once you got that path for that particular type of workload done, you can reuse it, and you already have the certainty that all these things you needed to address are already addressed in the golden path. I think that's the biggest difference from traditional migration. If you think about migration to a service, right, and you don't have to think about all these things, you're only thinking about what service you migrate into. But when you put this into perspective, you really have to understand all the relationship of your application, understand what other things has to be with it, and then start harvesting all this knowledge into a templatized format, into your platform operational knobs and dials, and it goes along with all the other parts.
I think that in some cases it's really hard for people even to understand what they should consider. And it's a great that you put in here like a list for things that people can understand. And I think the main challenge is going from that list to understand what do they have and how they can migrate it. And we will go into that in a few seconds. But I think that for people starting to think on migration or understand they are going to migrate something even in the next 3 or 5 years, it's really good to think about all of these aspects of your application today and understand, will it be easy migratable or not?
Absolutely. So taking all this, as we mentioned before, we harvest this into a golden path, and that kind of forces us to consider not everything, but a lot of the things we shared before. And what's the idea here, right? So if you try to break down some of the Lego bricks of application and a runtime environment, or we like to call it foundation because it's not only runtime, but runtime, along with other things you have to consider, like networking and security. But also separating between an app per se to sometimes data silos of shared resources that apps are using, because an app without the data is useless. So you also have to consider, okay, I need to move the data as well. And if I move the data, how do I make sure that the data that I moved already connected to that app that needs it, I have the right permission, and when I boot up my app, it will able to perform as if it was running on premise. So there are kind of different segments, but one thing to note, those three blocks you see here, they can have different relationships. So you can have that middle block app or many of it running under the same foundation, and you can have many of these apps actually connecting to multiple shared resources, or one shared resource can connect to multiple apps. So it's kind of various relationship between these building blocks that we build this migration on. And maybe just to set up the context of where is all this, where is the developer platform fits in all of this, right? We use the harmonics as a reference, but that could be, instead of that, it could be your developer platform. So at the core of everything, you still have your core controls or your foundation, where you set up your landing zone, your networking, your SCPs, all these things, account provisioning. So that comes before you can even talk about migration, because you can't really talk about migration before you figured out, okay, what's right looks to my organization. And how do I create accounts? How do I make sure my basic security is set? And then you'll have to figure out, usually you have to figure out networking. In most customers, networking is embedded in the landing zones. And then at some point, when you figure that one out, then you can start about talking about opinionated patterns, where this comes to, okay, now we're talking about the building blocks. You express them with some kind of an IAC. And then the last part is, okay, where do we put those patterns? How do we connect them between application and foundation? That's where everything kind of consolidated into the developer platform and a place to orchestrate all of these things together.
I have a question before we are
Sure.
moving forward.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned on the previous slide, like you mentioned, even the one before it, like you mentioned the fact that there is a data migration and application migration, and those are two like different things. Maybe you can explain a little bit like what is the difference, what they should like understand when I'm planning my migration or thinking about my migration when it comes to
In an
application.
ideal, sure, yeah. In an ideal situation, your data and your app are decoupled. It's not always the case, sadly, but in a good design or modern design, your application is stateless. All the data and configuration should come from a separate place. If that's the case, then your app essentially is a piece of code that runs somewhere, but it depends on data in order to achieve what it's supposed to achieve. So where that data resides, how does it being managed? What's the state of the data, right? Data is dynamic. It's never, mostly it doesn't, it's not static. That's something you have to figure out. And also migration of data is also pretty hard because of that nature that usually data is not static. It also comes into domains like DR, when you have to consider that, because if your application dies for whatever reason, you want to make sure you don't lose data, right? It's very, to some degree, it's very close to talking about migration of data, because you have to make sure you don't lose data. But in most cases, actually, I think data migration has a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of services that can help with data migration. I think developer platform can help, but that's the easier part of the problem to migrate data. The harder part, because application has a lot of pieces into it, such as pipeline and configurations and runtime, it becomes much harder to migrate them because each one has its own world. So they have to think about like pipelines and things like that. Well, how do they work in the new place? How do I adjust them there? And I think that's the real advantage of using opinionated patterns, because you already have figured it out when you build those patterns.
I think I would emphasize that, Zahi, the planning aspect of migration is extremely important. You've got to sit down and plan out in what order are you going to do data migration versus application migration. What are your shared resources that need to be put in place and up and solid and running before you can migrate other aspects of an application workload. But the key, one of the key things that Zahi, you're highlighting is the importance of identifying those patterns, because if you can identify common shared patterns across your application portfolio, then you can start grouping them together, and that's what's going to enable you to be able to migrate several of them in bulk, instead of having to treat every single workload as a snowflake that requires hand-holding and care and implementation. That will take you forever. So that identification of common patterns is extremely important.
Yeah, just to maybe make that a little bit more concrete, let's say you had a whole bunch of microservices that you wanted to migrate. Well, step one could be with a developer platform and portal that you set up a template that's a golden path for microservice APIs. And normally what you would do is you would spin up a new API by interacting with your portal and inputting inputs into it, like what's the name of it and different types of inputs. But what we're saying is that in the migration flow, you can actually set up that template for APIs, and instead of manually going into your portal and creating a new app, you're essentially importing your application into your developer platform and also having the automation behind the scenes to create the environmental infrastructure that your application would need to run.
Got it. So thank you all. And I will just mention for the people that watching us from the office or home or whatever, if you do like to ask questions, please just write on the comments and we will see it in here. Cool. Sorry for interrupting.
Maybe that's a good swing to Anthony and Jim talk about the migration plan and automation of the migration plan, some of the work with the step function. You want to share a little bit about that?
Does the next slide have a picture on it, Zahi? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Jim, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll start, and Anthony, you kind of join in. So as we approached one set of migrations, as Zahi was alluding to, there's actually quite a bit of orchestration that you need to put in place. So we were starting from that proprietary template, that proprietary descriptor file that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Using that, we mapped out what's in this descriptor file, what describes the application, and especially important, what does its runtime environment need to look like. And as we kind of thought through the ordering of how resources needed to be created in AWS, we realized that creation of resources is not automatic. It's not instantaneous. Sometimes if you're, say, spinning up a new ECS cluster, as we were in this particular case, that may take a little while. And there's other AWS resources. Our RDS databases are a great example where they can take a little while to provision. And so, as we thought about not just the sequencing of resources that needed to be created to line everything up, there's actually pauses. You need to wait for resource creation provisioning to complete. And so that led us to really thinking more about what kind of orchestration do we need. It led us to using, for AWS, the step functionality. Step functions proved to be a really great solution for us because we were able to pass data from one step to the next as the migration moved across states. We were able to put in place wait conditions, so we could put in place some validation routines that knew how to go and check to see, did a a cluster get provisioned successfully? Is it in a ready and waiting state, so that we can now move on to some additional steps to deploy an application into that cluster? Step functions as an orchestrator also enabled us for the ability to run certain steps in parallel, so that we could optimize on the amount of time that it takes to complete a full application migration. So what you see here in this flow diagram that Zahi's got on the slide deck maps out a little bit of what we were going through. The things that you see there about provider template and environment template are specific to Harmonics, but it does show you here that you can map out specific resources or components, some of them being able to be run in parallel, but sequencing the full migration process from beginning to end.
Maybe throw in one more word in the just as a concept of what's migration plan in a sense, right? It's not what you think in the sense of, oh, we orchestrated infrastructure as code in a certain way, which is true, but it's not exactly the concept. The concept is saying, think about a migration plan as a set of instructions to use your existing templates, right? Whatever you express those golden path, and each one of those golden path templates have the infrastructure as code, it has the pipeline, it has everything that needs to be done in order to provision it in the right way. So now the automation is focused, okay, I got this set of templates I need to provision, and I need to time them, and I need to do all of that. And once they are triggered, I'm going to monitor them and see where a template is successfully provisioned. And then I'm making the assumption that all the infrastructure as code is ready and I can build on top of it. So that's essentially the concept. And as Jim mentioned, there is a lot of parallelizing things, so we can run things that we don't have to wait. On the other hand, sometimes we can't deploy an application to Kubernetes if the cluster is not ready. So whatever that may be the case, and the cool thing is that migration plan, because the agnostic of what infrastructure as code you're using, it actually based on the templates. So if tomorrow we have a different requirement for migration that, let's say, use serverless deployment and migration to serverless, we can still use exactly the same migration plan and orchestration without changing anything, just changing the templates we're using. And behind them have everything reflected, so we don't have to invent the wheel how to do migrations again. Hope that makes sense.
I have a question. It's really cool that you use like step functions and able to codify, I would call it, the migration path or the migration plan. But I have a question, it's maybe a silly one, but I can create those templates in other tools. I can use, CDK and deploy a cloud formation. Why do I have to use, or what is the benefit of using step functions or these workflows?
Well, we've broken down the different pieces of an application into the three main categories I think we showed on a slide previously, where we have shared resources. That could be something like a database that multiple applications hit. Then we have our environment infrastructure. You could think about that as maybe an ECS cluster, an EKS cluster, or different things that you might need to set up for an application to run in a particular account, all the infrastructure it needs. And then the third piece is the app piece. And what we found is that the app needs to be the last piece that is deployed. So you've got multiple steps at a time, and each step actually has its own infrastructure as code that needs to run. So what the step function is going to do is it's going to run infrastructure as code for all of your environment provisioning. And then once that's done, it'll set up any shared resources, run Terraform or CDK or whatever to set up your databases, your S3 buckets, whatever your shared resources are. And then finally, it'll run the infrastructure as code. If your application has any application-specific infrastructure as code, it'll run that too. So that's basically the reason why we're using step functions to kind of wrap these multiple steps that each have their own infrastructure as code step.
Yeah, and also, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to say it's amazing, the ability to formalize the plan in code and then use the right tool for it. In my opinion,
Yeah.
that's it.
Also, just remember that we're not just talking about infrastructure as code, because when we provision a template, the template gets its own Git provider, whether it's GitLab or GitHub, whatever that may be. It comes with its own pipeline. It has a baked-in security features. So if you try to express all this in infrastructure as code, it's going to be extremely difficult. Infrastructure is what is excellent to describing infrastructure. That's what it's supposed to do. But the other part of it is just not captured in traditional infrastructure as code. And I think that's what was missing that modern developer platform gives you. Right? It gives you the ability to express more on the conceptual thing of template of an app.
I think the just to highlight, another example. Say you're migrating. Maybe you're a user of some sort of a SIEM solution or some other third-party tool that you might want to register the application as it gets moved into the cloud. Those API calls that you might need to make to other third parties are very easy to inject into a step function and monitor for success, make sure that it's done in the proper sequence. So like Zahi said, not everything is infrastructure as code. There's going to be a lot of steps that you might want to automate interacting with other pieces of your solution.
So what we wanted to share here is we talk about the migration plan, which is a descriptive way to say what do we want to migrate, how do we define the pieces, the templates, everything that we need. And now the execution of it, which we mentioned step function, it's true. But if we try to take one slice of a migration plan, kind of imagine how it would look like, well, part of the application deployment itself is a whole thing, right? Whether you use foundational thing, environment, all these things, and then you deploy the actual application and the shared resources, all of that. But then once you did that, you got a blank application with mostly nothing, with maybe a connection to a database, but there's nothing there. So now we come into the actual migration of the deployment. So we're talking about, okay, move the source code of the application, build the code, right? Now, if we did a good job building that template, we don't have to do anything but a commit, because a commit of the source code will trigger the build process. It will trigger the deployment process. It will do all of these things for us. So, that's again the benefit of using template that we already configure the right pipeline into them, rather than just doing infrastructure as code. And of course, the next part is the data. You're likely to do the data before you push the code itself, because you want your app, once it's built and running, to already be able to connect and fetch the data it needs to run. But that's kind of an illustration of the actual process rather than the plan itself. I think this is almost the last step. So migration validation. So assuming everything went well, which is never the case, but assuming it did, how do we know our migration is successful? There could be multiple reasons why it's not successful. So articulating the validation of a migration is also an important aspect of migration. We're not going to talk about data validation, because that's a whole different data states and validation. It's a whole different thing. But basic things like unit testing, integration testing, performance testing, these could be done and automate, and you should do it because it gives you the certainty that the migration not only went through, it went through successfully. Right? If you build in a more sensitive system, resiliency testing is good too. You can try to kill your app and see if it's able to recover and things like that and not lose data. But I think that's kind of what we implemented some of this, but what you have to consider when doing migration validation. Okay.
Yeah, like I wanted to ask, like the validation is um, maybe the hardest part, right? Because you need to take a yes or no decision. Are we good to go, or or not? But on the other side, there are like things like hybrid scenarios when you run on both like the previous platform or the previous tools that you use and the new ones. Do you see that as a common use case or not really? Like running on hybrid for some time?
I think hybrid is it's a little tricky word because there's many meanings of hybrid. Hybrid, a lot of people, I think the majority of people, when they talk about hybrid, they're talking about the platform is capable to do all things, meaning it's capable to do things on a particular cloud or other clouds, and it's capable to do things on premise. It doesn't mean that there is necessarily a connection between the traditional native cloud applications. They have everything in the cloud, so their data, everything is there. Can you connect the two? Of course you can, right? And some customers do. Some customers have their application running in the cloud, but some of the data actually sits on premise and they reach out. Usually those things are resolved in the networking aspect. So the application have no idea. It just know a configuration to tell it to go to this endpoint and fetch what it needs. So it solves behind the scene, right? But from a platform point of view, you do have to consider, because one of the responsibilities of the platform is to have a right representation of your catalog. So you do have to consider, okay, if I have something that sits elsewhere, how do I make sure I have, a resemblance in it in the platform, and how do I make sure the relationship that thing has with other apps are captured as well? Because again, maybe one day in the future you would want to migrate out of the platform you just built, and you don't want to guess those things. So it's nice to be able to maintain this and query it, so you know exactly, how to move it to the next thing if you'll need to.
I think when we hear customers talking about hybrid, as Zahi was explaining, there's a lot of different. You have to dive into those questions and make sure you really understand what the specific use cases are. But generally, I think what I've heard from customers is they're talking about some sort of a scenario where a legacy application might be living on-prem, and they're trying to gradually move to the cloud. And I think that's more of a modernization story than maybe necessarily a migration. And there are certainly lots of patterns that you can adopt. The Strangler Fig pattern is certainly one that's popular, where you can kind of gradually over time break apart your monolith applications into microservices. And I think some of the migration strategies that we're talking about with golden paths can be very helpful in building those new microservices as part of modernizing an app. But I think that's usually slightly different use cases than what we're talking about for migration versus modernization.
Thank you. And something that we see a lot, especially like you mentioned that you're working with large financial institutions, is that their infrastructure is not that simple. It's not like a single account, single region kind of deployment. Usually they want to have like highly available fault tolerance, maybe deploy multi-account into the AWS account, multi-region, even like cloud. Like, can we design this kind of migration to be multi?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's too simplistic to say that what we're trying to do is to take an application that's running on-prem and get it running in the cloud, or to get it running on whatever our standard platform is, because every application needs to have different environments that it runs in. It needs to have a dev environment at least, and maybe a test QA environment, maybe staging and prod. And so it's too simplistic to just try to create one environment for the application to run in. And so a good way of thinking about that is because you can break down the creation of environments into a specific step, you can then, as part of your migration, you can declare that your application needs a dev environment, a test environment, a prod environment, and all the same automation can work for those environments to get all of those set up before the application is migrated over. And then also based upon those configurations, the application's CI/CD pipeline can become aware of those different environments that are utilized and set up a multi-environment configuration, which may or may not involve multi-account, multi-region. But that's a great thing about being able to automate those environments, is that it can be set up per account and per region if you want, or it can be shared. It's kind of abstracted if you do it right from the application.
I like it. I think it really emphasizes the power of a platform, and how you can create, like, let's say, a simple, I would call it a simple capability, but a simple interface with a really complex things out there behind that user don't need to see or don't need to understand how all of them actually works.
Yeah, and come to think about it, the only thing you have truly is your code, is your app code. Everything else is debatable. Where it's going to run, how it's going to be provisioned, how it's going to be deployed. All these things could be, articulated based on the cloud provider, the multi-account, with the setup you have, whether it's a multi-region or not, or single account. I think that's the main advantage when you think about abstraction and developer platform, that you can really build your own concept into those abstractions and hide some of the complexity from developers. Yep.
Cool. We almost run out of time. So before we are done, I want to say thank you. Thank you a lot for joining me in the session, explain like the migration part and how the platform actually can help, and how we can, like, even regardless of the platform, I think it's a really valuable session to understand how do you plan, what do you need to take into consideration, and also when it comes to platform, how actually can we do that and which technologies can achieve and can help us. I think it's really good also to emphasize the use of harmonics. So for people watching us, check the website, because it, like, some of the, but correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the things that you already said are kind of implemented in harmonics already.
Some samples, yes.
Amazing. So it's not only like just on the deck, it's actually real code that you can use.
It's worth saying too that Harmonics is open source, so this is not a call to go spend any money or anything like that. Go check out the website and kind of see the concepts that Harmonics has, and if you want to try it out, it's open source. You can download it and try it out for yourself.
Yeah, let me even post the GitHub for it.
Thank you.
Cool. So Anthony, Jim, and Zahi, thank you very much for being. Thank you very much for sharing all of your knowledge, technicalities, and stories of your of challenges that you see on your day to day. And also thank you everyone for watching us. See you next week. Next week we are going to have a live stream about platform engineering at JFrog, the company that created Artifactory. So thank you everyone for watching. Join us next week. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.